Good day everyone, I am Zenobia Bandolis together with Cueva and Jobian Labanda, and we are going to report the Utilitarian Approach. Revolution in Ethics. The late 18th and 19th century brought an astonishing series of upheavals, such as the modern nation-state emerged from the French Revolution, the wreckage of the Napoleonic Empire. The Revolution of 1848 showed the power of liberty, equality, and fraternity as moral ideas. America gained its independence from the British Empire and ratified a constitution that promised an open and democratic society. And the American Civil War ended slavery in Western civilization. Because of this, it is not surprising that new ideas about ethics emerged in this era. In particular, Jeremy Bentham made a powerful argument for a novel conception of morality. He urged that morality is not about pleasing God, nor it is about being faithful to abstract rules. Rather, morality is about making the world as happy as possible. Thus, he believed in one ultimate moral principle, the principle of utility. This principle requires us in all circumstances to produce the most happiness and the least unhappiness that we can. Jeremy Bentham led a group of radicals who worked to reform the laws and institutions of England along utilitarian lines. One of his followers was James Mill, the distinguished Scottish philosopher, historian, and economist. James Mill's son, John Stuart Mill, would become the leading advocate of utilitarian moral theory. John Stuart's advocacy was even more elegant and persuasive than Bentham's. His book, Utilitarianism, 1861, is still required reading for serious students of ethics. At first glance, the principle of utility may not seem like such a radical idea. Yet, in their own way, Bentham and Mill was as revolutionary as the other two great intellectual innovators of the 19th century, Charles Darwin and Karl Marx. To understand why the principle of utility was so radical, consider that what it leaves out of morality. Gone are all references to God or to abstract moral rules written in the heavens. Morality is no longer understood as obedience to some divinely given code or some set of inflexible rules. As mentioned, the utilitarians were social reformers as well as philosophers. They wanted their doctrine to make a difference not only in thought but in practice. To illustrate this, let's examine the implications of utilitarianism for three practical issues: euthanasia, marijuana, and the treatment of non-human animals. This will give us a sense of the theory. First example, euthanasia. For this issue, let's take for example Sigmund Freud, the legendary psychologist. In his last few years, he was diagnosed with oral cancer. A large swelling formed in the back of his mouth, and he would have no more good days. Freud's cancer was active and inoperable, and he was also suffering from heart failure. As his bones decayed, they cast off a foul smell, driving away his favorite dog, and mosquito netting had to be draped over his bed to keep flies away. On September 21, at the age of 83, Freud asked Max Schur, his friend and personal physician, to end his misery. Dr. Schur understood Freud's request and he injected Freud with a drug in order to end his life. And after that, he soon felt relief and fell into a peaceful sleep, Dr. Schur wrote. So, did Max Schur do anything wrong? In the eyes of the church, what Schur did was morally wrong, based on the dominant moral tradition in our culture. Also, Christianity holds that human life is a gift from God and that only God may decide to end it. The early church prohibited all killing, believing that Jesus' teachings permitted no exception to the rule. Later, the church recognized some exceptions for this, such as capital punishment and killing in war, but suicide and euthanasia remained forbidden. Utilitarianism takes a different approach. It asks, which action available to Max Schur would have produced the greatest balance of happiness over unhappiness. The person whose happiness was most at stake was Sigmund Freud's. If Schur had not killed him, Freud would have lived on in wrenched pain. How much unhappiness would have this involved? Killing him ended his agony. Therefore, utilitarians support euthanasia in such cases. Although this argument is very different from the arguments in the Christian tradition, the classical utilitarians did not think they were advocating atheistic or anti-religious philosophy. Bentham thought that the faithful would endorse utilitarian standpoint if only they viewed God as benevolent. Bentham might ask, could a benevolent God forbid the killing of Sigmund Freud? If someone were to say, God is caring and loving, but he forbids us from putting Freud out of his misery. The majority of religious people disagree with Bentham, and not only our moral tradition, also our legal tradition has evolved around the influence of Christianity. In general, we shouldn't outlaw morally acceptable behavior. Bentham was trained in law, and he taught that the principle of utility as a guide for both legislators and ordinary people. The purpose of the law, he taught, is to promote the welfare of all citizens. In order to serve this purpose, the law should restrict people's freedom as little as possible. In particular, no activity should be outlawed unless it is harmful or dangerous to others. Thus, the classical utilitarians' laws against euthanasia are unjustified restrictions on people's ability to control their own lives. When Max Schur killed Sigmund Freud, he was helping Freud end his life in the matter that Freud had chosen. No one else was harmed, and so it was no one else's business.
Our second example is about marijuana from a utilitarianism perspective. William Bennett was America's first drug czar or directed the drug control policies. From 1989 to 1991, he was President George H.W. Bush's top advisor on drug policy. He advocated the aggressive enforcement of U.S. drug laws. Bennett also holds a PhD in philosophy, made an argument that said, the simple fact is that drug use is wrong, and the moral argument in the end is the most compelling argument. Bennett's moral argument is just the assertion that drug use is wrong by its very nature. However, the utilitarian perspective about the argument is there is no simple facts as to whether drug use is immoral, but rather the moral argument must address whether drug use increases or decreases happiness. Even though people have strong feelings on this topic, like younger people who use drugs might be defensive and deny that pot or marijuana causes harm, and older people who don't use drugs might be judgmental. A good utilitarian will ignore such feelings since they focus more on whether drug use increases or decreases happiness. There are pros and cons of marijuana as according to utilitarianism. As for pros, the main benefit of marijuana is the pleasure it brings. Marijuana enormously relaxing, but marijuana can greatly enhance the pleasure of sensory activities such as eating, listening to music, and etc. Even though, even though some people believe that enjoyment is irrelevant to morality, from a utilitarian perspective, the whole issue is whether pot increases or decreases happiness. The point is, if something feels good, then it is good, at least to that extent. As for the cons, marijuana does not cause violence, but tends to make people passive, not aggressive. Marijuana is not a gateway drug or habit-forming drug that may lead to people to crave and use harder drugs. Marijuana is not highly addictive. The cons implies that marijuana cannot be highly addictive through which the people cannot be satisfied and enjoy it. That leads to decreasing their happiness. There are 4 disadvantages of marijuana, which the utilitarian must weigh against benefits. First is some people do get addicted to pot. Marijuana withdrawal is not as traumatic as heroin withdrawal, but quitting can be unpleasant. Next is long-term heavy use can cause mild cognitive damage which may decrease happiness. Third is getting high all the time would make a person unproductive. And lastly, smoking pot is bad for your respiratory system and your gums. The utilitarian concluded that casual use of marijuana to be matter of personal preference. Heavy marijuana uses raises more complex issues. Does the pleasure one gets from long-term heavy use outweigh the disadvantages? It probably depends on the person. Should pot be illegal according to utilitarianism? The fact that many people enjoy getting high is a strong reason to legalize the drug according to utilitarianism. If marijuana were legal, more people would use it, and two worries arise from that fact. First is society as a whole might become less productive, and second, more people might drive while high. It should be noted, however, that marijuana impairs driving ability only slightly, if at all, because marijuana tends to heighten the senses and make people drive more cautiously. There are four big costs to maintaining laws. First is the extent to which America's stance on marijuana fuels the drug wars around the world, especially in Mexico. Because the United States outlawed the sale of marijuana and pressures other countries to do the same. This makes the drug industry more violent. Second is the lost revenue. With marijuana illegal, society spends money on enforcing the laws. However, if with marijuana legal, society makes money by taxing the drug. Third is harm inflicted upon the offenders. Utilitarians care about these harms even though the harms are inflicted on lawbreakers who knew they might be punished. Lastly, the ill will that the enforcement of drug laws creates in minority communities. Almost all utilitarians favor the legalization of marijuana. On the whole, pot or marijuana is much less harmful than alcohol or cigarettes, which Western societies already tolerate. However, utilitarians must be flexible if new evidence emerges that shows marijuana to be more harmful than what was previously thought, then the utilitarian view might change.
For our third and last example, in the utilitarian approach, we will talk about non-human animals. The treatment of animals has traditionally been regarded as a trivial matter. Christians believe that man alone is made in God's image and that animals do not have souls. The traditional view on animals according to St. Thomas Aquinas is that animals are intended for man's use in the natural order of divine providence. It is not unethical for man to exploit them. Aquinas acknowledges that it is wrong to be cruel to animals, but the reason has to do with human welfare, not the welfare of the animals. In the traditional doctrine or theological justification, people and animals are in separate moral categories. Animals have no moral standing of their own. We are free to treat them in any way we please. It seems extreme in its lack of concern for non-human animals, many of which are, after all, intelligent and sensitive creatures, yet much of our conduct is guided by this doctrine. We eat animals, we use them as experimental subjects in our laboratories, we use their skins for clothing and their heads as wall ornaments, we make them the objects of our amusement in circuses and rodeos, and we track them down and kill them for sport. Western philosophers also have their own secular view on animals. Philosophers have said that animals are not rational, that they lack the ability to speak, or that they are simply not human. And all these are given as reasons why their interest lies outside the sphere of moral concern. The utilitarians, however, disagree. In their view, what matters is not whether an animal has a soul, is rational, or any of the rest. All that matters is whether it can experience happiness and unhappiness. Bentham argued that whether an animal is human or non-human is just as relevant as whether it is black or white, and that the question is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer. Whether it is a human or an animal that suffers is simply irrelevant. To Bentham and Mill, this line of reasoning was conclusive. Humans and non-humans are equally entitled to moral concern. But are animals really equal to humans? Well, there are factual differences between them that will justify many differences in treatment. For example, because of their intellectual capacities, humans can take pleasure in many things that non-humans cannot enjoy: mathematics, movies, literature, strategy games, and so on. And similarly, humans' superior capacities make them capable of frustrations and disappointments that other animals cannot experience. Thus, our duty to promote happiness entails a duty to promote those special enjoyments for humans, as well as to prevent any special harm they might suffer. At the same time, however, we have a moral duty to take into account the suffering of animals, and their suffering counts equally with any similar suffering experienced by humans. Richard D. Ryder, a British psychologist, introduced to us the term speciesism. This is the idea that animal interests matter less than human interests. Utilitarians believe that speciesism is discrimination against other species, just as racism is discrimination against other races. To further explain why there is speciesism, Ryder questions how we can possibly justify allowing experiments on animals. For example, in Maryland, 1996, scientists used beagle dogs to study septic shock. They cut holes in the dogs' throats and placed E. coli infected clots into their stomachs. Within 3 weeks, most of the dogs had died. In Taiwan, in 1997, scientists dropped weights on rats' spines in order to study spinal injury. The researchers found that greater injuries were caused by dropping the weights from greater heights. Since the 1990s, chimpanzees, monkeys, dogs, cats, and rodents have been studied to study alcoholism. After addicting the animals to alcohol, scientists have observed such symptoms as vomiting, tremor, anxiety, and seizures. When the animals are in alcoholic withdrawal, scientists have induced convulsions by lifting them by their tails, by giving them electric shocks, and by injecting chemicals into their brains. Now, based on those examples, it is evident that the animals in these experiments were obviously caused terrible suffering. To answer the question shown on the slide on when are experiments on animals morally acceptable or unacceptable, we first have to ask these questions. Was there any compensating gain in happiness that justified it? Was greater unhappiness being prevented for other animals or for humans? If not, then the experiments were morally unacceptable. The utilitarian principle does, however, imply that experiments which cause a lot of pain require significant justification. Now, criticizing animal experiments is too easy for most of us. We may feel self-righteous or superior because we do not do such research ourselves. All of us, however, are involved in cruelty when we eat meat. The facts about meat production are more disturbing than any facts about animal experimentation. Farm animals live in abhorrent conditions before being taken off to slaughter. Veal calves, for example, spend 24 hours per day in pens so small that they cannot turn around, lie down comfortably, or even twist their heads around to get rid of parasites on their own bodies. The producers put them in tiny pens to save money and to keep the meat tender. The cows clearly miss their mothers, and like human infants, they want something to suck. So they try in vain to suck the sides of their wooden stalls. The calves are also fed a diet deficient in iron and roughage in order to keep their meat pale and tasty. Their craving for iron becomes so strong that if they're allowed to turn around, they will lick their own urine, which normally they cannot. They cannot. Without roughage, the calves cannot form a cud to chew. For this reason, they cannot be given straw bedding, because they would eat it in an attempt to consume roughage. So for these animals, the slaughterhouse is not an unpleasant end to an otherwise contented existence. The veal calf is just one example. Chickens, turkeys, pigs, and adult cows all live in horrible conditions before being slaughtered. Now, the system of meat production causes an enormous suffering for animals with no compensating benefits. Therefore, we should abandon that system. We should either become vegetarians or else treat our animals humanely before killing them. We normally assume that human beings are alone in deserving moral consideration. Utilitarianism challenges that assumption and insists that we should care about any creature that feels pleasure and pain. Human beings are indeed special in many ways, and an adequate morality must acknowledge that fact. But in the utilitarian approach, we have to remember that we are not the only animals capable of suffering, and that adequate morality must acknowledge that fact as well. That ends our discussion on the utilitarian approach. Thank you for your time and have a good day.